Okay, thank you for joining this session. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss the topic of transnational maritime environmental crimes with this wonderful group of experts. This session brings to life a research topic I co-edited with Dr. Annette Hubschler that was recently published in Frontiers of Conservation Science, Conservation Social Sciences. I will put the link in the research topic to the research topic in the chat. First, I will provide a topic overview and then invite the panelists to delve into the topic further. In our increasingly globalized world, transnational maritime environmental crimes, TMEC, have become a major concern for international law and policymakers due to their significant and often uncertain impacts. The vast and complex nature of maritime spaces poses unique challenges to global conservation efforts, complicating the harmonization of international laws and policies. These challenges are compounded by the diverse and evolving nature of maritime crimes. Addressing TMEC effectively requires a comprehensive and multidisciplinary approach, recognizing these crimes as international, regional, and domestic levels through robust regulatory and adaptive policy frameworks. TMECs are not only diverse in their manifestations, but also transnational, with criminal activities crossing national borders and exploiting the vastness of international waters. The movements between state borders and international waters complicates law enforcement efforts, as actors involved in TMEC frequently exploit these jurisdictional complexities to carry out their illegal activities with relative impunity. Respecting the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea's intent for freedom of navigation on the high seas, effective responses to TMEC require international alignment, strong political will, and coordinated efforts across borders. This need for coordinated global action is further underscored by global challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic, maritime boundary disputes, and climate change, all of which exacerbate the potential harm of TMEC, particularly for low and middle income countries and small island developing states in the global south. Despite growing awareness of the severity of these crimes, law enforcement efforts are often outmatched by the sophisticated and stealth of organized criminal syndicates involved in TMEC. These criminal networks are highly adaptable, using advanced technologies and complex logistical networks to evade detection, arrest, and prosecution. As a result, building a comprehensive and multidisciplinary knowledge base is therefore essential for the international community, including states and non-state actors, to effectively respond to current and emerging threats posed by TMEC. It is within this complex setting we sought to broaden the knowledge base for which innovative solutions could grow. The knowledge base must integrate insights from various disciplines, including criminology, environmental science, and international law, to develop innovative strategies that can address the unique challenges of TMEC. The subdiscipline of blue criminology provides valuable insight into understanding and addressing TMEC. Blue criminology expands traditional criminological frameworks to include environmental harms, particularly those affecting the world's oceans from a socio-ecological perspective. Within this framework, TMEC should be viewed as an umbrella term that encompasses both traditional maritime crimes like illegal fishing and maritime pollution, as well as modern variations on crimes such as ecocide and underwater cultural heritage trafficking. This broader perspective is crucial for developing more effective and sustainable responses to TMEC, but requires innovative multidisciplinary thinking. We recognized an opportunity to explore TMEC in this research topic through innovative blue thinking by building upon our earlier research, publications, and expert consultations. The ecological, socioeconomic, and security implications of TMEC are profound. Oceans are critical to life on Earth, providing oxygen, regulating climate, and supporting a vast diversity of life forms. TMEC poses a direct threat to the health of marine ecosystems, leading to biodiversity loss, habitat degradation, and the disruption of essential ecological processes. From a socioeconomic perspective, many communities, particularly in the global south, depend on the ocean for their livelihoods through activities like fishing, tourism, and trade. TMEC undermines these industries by depleting resources, polluting environments, and destabilizing local economies. Moreover, TMEC is often linked to broader transnational organized crime networks which exploit poorly regulated maritime spaces to conduct illegal activities with impunity, thereby posing significant challenges to global security. Given these challenges and opportunities, this research topic sought to understand the relevant TMEC problems and optimize strategies that limit the prevalence for crimes to occur within this ocean setting. With the focus on the global south, the topic also emphasizes the importance of local community-led and gendered responses to these maritime crimes. Such approaches are crucial for ensuring these strategies are culturally relevant and address the specific needs and circumstances of local communities. Additionally, this topic aligns closely with Sustainable Development Goal 14, Life Below Water, which aims to conserve and sustainably use the ocean, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. By addressing TMEC within the framework of SDG 14, this research topic contributes to global efforts to protect marine environments and support the livelihoods of coastal communities. We have 4 panelists who contributed to the research topic who are with us today, and I will briefly introduce. I will start with my co-editor of the TMEC research topic, Dr. Annette Hoopschle, Associate Professor within the Global Risk Governance Program in the Public Law Department of the University of Cape Town's Faculty of Law. Dr. Julie Berg, a Senior Lecturer in Criminology at the School of Social and Political Sciences and the Director of the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research at the University of Glasgow. Julie is also a Senior Research Fellow in the Global Risk Governance Program at the University of Cape Town. Dr. Sarah Lothian is a Senior Lecturer and Academic Barrister at the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security at the University of Wollongong. Charlotte Lurham is a late-stage PhD candidate at the University of Western Australia Law School and also works as an antiquities trafficking analyst at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office in New York City. She has a background in maritime archaeology, anthropology, and Southeast Asian studies. Finally, my name is Dr. Jade Lindley, and I'm an Associate Professor at the University of Western Australia Law School and a member of the UWA Oceans Institute. I now redirect to Annette and Julie, who introduced the concept of Southern Blue Criminology in their paper titled Southern Blue Criminology, Rethinking Ocean Harmscapes in a Global Context. Julie, can you please provide an overview of the new theoretical lens of Southern Blue Criminology and reframing of ocean harmscapes?
Great, thank you, Jade, and thank you for all the attendees for attending our panel. So essentially, Annette and I came up with this concept of Southern Blue Criminology, which is obviously an extension of Blue Criminology, and it's really just kind of a means, a theoretical way in which we consider the contextual uniqueness sometimes of Southern context, Southern spaces. And so it's just a way to take into account contextually relevant governance systems that are in place or not in place in Southern contexts that kind of require a different way of framing or understanding the problem. So what we've come up with is kind of 4 best principles by which we define what Southern Blue Criminology is about. And it's not best practices. It's not these are the practices that we need to implement, because practices cannot be universal, again, given contextual kind of uniqueness of some context. So we talk about principles in terms of 4 ways of thinking, or 4 sensibilities, 4 kind of paradigms in which we should consider dealing with ocean harms in Southern contexts. And so I will go through kind of the 4 best principles that we've come up with. And the first one we've come up with is that we need to move beyond crime-centric or crime-only sensibilities and consider ocean harmscapes. So what I mean by this is that if we have crime-only or crime-centric responses as the normative and the default response to all ocean harms, we're missing a bigger picture. We're usually kind of crowding out alternative solutions, because criminal justice-centric or crime-centric or criminalization practices tend to favor a certain solution to a variety of different problems. As Jade was outlining, there's a variety of different harms that we're engaging with. Is a crime-centric approach kind of appropriate in each and every and all of these contexts. It also makes huge assumptions that there is a criminal justice system, a working, functioning, effective criminal justice system apparatus in place in Southern contexts, assuming that there's a capable law enforcement body that's actually going to enforce the law or criminal law, whatever law. So it's not to say that no harms or ocean harms should be criminalized. It's to say we can't have that as our normative or our only starting point in dealing with ocean harms. And so it also kind of presumes that there's a victim and offender, and that'll speak to a principle that I speak to a bit later. Well, who's the offender when you have rising sea levels? So you can't always dichotomize a discrete victim, a discrete offender, or even a discrete event. Kind of criminal justice system tends to extract events and criminalize those events without considering how they kind of fall in place in terms of longer term practices and the intertwining of humans and nature. So, and criminalization also tends to, the way it's implemented, tends to target the most vulnerable, the most marginalized groups. You don't see corporations being arrested. They might be fined, it might not make much difference, but most of the time, it's criminalization of the most vulnerable populations who are very often dependent on ocean resources. Easy targets, if you like, in terms of the way that criminalization is actually enacted. So we talk then about ocean harmscapes rather than crimes, because we want to understand the fact that these harmscapes or harm landscapes, so we talk about harmscapes as kind of transcending spatial and temporal and conceptual understandings of crime, because crime narrows it. It allows for only a blaming and punishment response, and it doesn't take into account that oceans are becoming increasingly harmful to humans. And there's a convergence of harms, of old harms, overfishing, pollution, converging with new harms, climate-related harms, such as ocean acidification, ocean warming, for instance, sea levels rising. And so we want to introduce this notion of ocean harmscapes as considering a movement away from crime-centric responses to understanding the ocean as a broader harmscape recipient and a source of harm that requires kind of broader responses. And so this leads into the second best principle, which is moving away from state-centric responses to whole of society responses. And whole of society simply means that whoever's best placed to resolve that problem should be involved in the solution. I mean, we always by default leave it up to certain institutions to resolve complex problems. But what if these institutions only have one solution, hence crime-centric responses, criminalization, which may or may not be appropriate to those particular harms given the convergence with other harms. And so whole of society, or also kind of a polycentric governance approach, means really kind of drawing on whoever's appropriate to resolve that problem. It doesn't mean drawing on everybody all the time to resolve problems. It means, well, who's best placed to resolve this? And sometimes it might be those who are involved in the harm. Again, employing a single solution to every problem is not going to resolve that problem. It also makes huge assumptions, hence the Southern approach. It makes huge assumptions that the state is equipped to engage with this problem. What if the state is complicit? What if the state is a source of harm? What if the state is weak, absent, illegitimate, ineffective? And this brings us to our third best principle in terms of recognizing that a Western-centric solution, normative solution, is not appropriate. We need to be absolutely context dependent. We need to be flexible in terms of the responses that we have to ocean harmscapes, given the nature of some contexts where plural governance is the norm, where governance is informal, hybrid, where the non-state is more important than the state, especially small island contexts, small island developing contexts, where very often communities lead, where community-led or community-driven responses are the norm. Do you then kind of shift to a Western-centric, crime-centric solution, state-centric solution in these contexts where it's not appropriate? And it's often because we have kind of global normative understandings of what good governance entails. And it's usually state-centric understandings of good governance. But myself and others have done research on the fact that sometimes the private sector is better able to cater to the public good than the state, depending on the context. So the context is so vital. And so we can't just apply universally accepted solutions or goals. We need to understand the context, and we need to, again, understand the fact that governance can be fluid, hybrid, informal in these contexts, and you need to draw on whoever's best placed to engage with the solution to that problem, rather than assuming it's always the state or a criminalized response. And so that leads me to kind of the fourth and the final best principle, is trying to move away from a kind of a human-centric or anthropocentric understanding of our engagement with oceans to understand humans as kind of belonging to human, non-human assemblages. Again, this kind of criticizes a victim-offender dichotomy, but understands that humans are codependent with the ocean. It's also to move away from the fact that we think of oceans simply as a human resource to be used. It's actually the fact that humans are profoundly impacted by the ocean as an actant. The ocean is a non-human actant, which has profound implications for our survival, given the fact that the ocean is now becoming more and more a source of harm to us because of our actions. And so if you think of the ocean as kind of assemblage of human, non-human engagement, a kind of a crime-centric approach seems to be ridiculous, because if the ocean cannot be fined or prosecuted or criminalized, and it's also to recognize that it's profoundly integrated into kind of human dependency, survival. And so it's just to simply recognize these entanglements or assemblages between humans and the ocean. And also to final point is to say that, of course, ocean harmscapes are no longer local or global. We're now thinking of planetary harms. The ocean is a planetary actant. And if you think of the ocean as a planetary actant, which has profound impacts on human livability and survival, you have to be innovative and think very much outside the box. And it has more and profound impacts in southern contexts. Hence, Annette and I introducing this concept of southern blue criminology. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. That's really interesting. Annette, this concept was something then carried through into the paper we co-wrote, which was called Blue Crimes and Ocean Harmscapes, Strategies for Tackling TMECs in the Global South. Can you please provide an overview as to how TMECs link to organised crime and the challenges it creates for the Global South?
The trick with the microphone. So thank you. Thanks for putting together the panel, Jade. So yeah, transnational maritime environmental crimes are often very closely linked with organized crime, particularly as these illicit activities leverage complex and transnational networks that span both legal and illegal economies. So in the Global South, we often see that regulatory frameworks are inconsistent and enforcement capacities limited. And organized crime networks tend to exploit these gaps. So TMECs, such as illegal, unreported, and unregulated IUU fishing, pollution, trafficking of marine species, are highly profitable and typically low risk for these networks due to vast unmonitored maritime spaces. And I just like to tell a little anecdote. Years back, I did field work on a small Indian Ocean island. I'm not going to reveal which island, but at the time there'd been uptick in drug trafficking around this island. And I interviewed the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard literally had a small dinghy. That was what the capacity of this Coastal Guard to deal with any form of transgressions. So I think it's quite important to realize, we have very different contexts in terms of enforcement and what goes down. And I think one of the major challenges in Global South countries is that they often depend heavily on marine resources for economic and food security, and they face systemic pressures from these illicit activities. I know that, Jade, you've looked into abalone poaching in Australia at some stage. I've done that as well. And it's been really interesting to see how these networks play out, and the impact often on poor communities that actually survive, that have a livelihood from coastal or marine activities. Organized crime networks are often shielded by flags of convenience and weak enforcement in international waters, and this can also devastate local community livelihoods and ecosystem health. In our paper, Jade, I remember we were talking a lot about contested regulation or illegality and different ways of regulation. I think especially in the maritime space, there's such an issue of discrepancies between international, national, and regional. And I suppose the sector and society that draws the shortest straw are literally local communities, coastal communities that survive. And so the impact is particularly dire. Of course, the impact is also really, really bad on ecosystem health and just as general maritime health. Also, there are inequitable dynamics where southern regions bear the brunt of environmental degradation while organized crime reaps the benefits. Julie made a very, very good point earlier where she said we're often pursuing the small actors. So it's the coastal, the small scale fishers, but we're not paying attention to the corporate criminals, or would we call them blue collar criminals in the sea space? I don't know. Maybe another idea, another conceptualization that is waiting to happen. But I grew up in Namibia, and we've seen so much in that space of international fishing trawlers coming in, and it's not even always a flag of convenience. It's just a pure opportunity and large scale fishing. So there's a lot of that happening. Just a last point that I want to make is that this concept of Southern blue criminology that Julie and I developed, I think it is really, really a helpful framework that addresses the structural disparities. But it's very important to integrate local knowledge systems, and that's what we've been trying with these perspectives. So basically, we're proposing these very context-specific, adaptive, and whole-of-society responses. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Yep, that's so interesting. And thank you for tying it back to Julie's work too. That's exactly what I wanted. Charlotte, we're now going to turn to you as the concept of transnational crime was central to the discussion in the paper that you and I co-wrote as well, which is Preventing and Protecting Against Underwater Cultural Heritage Crime. Can you please explain the link between underwater cultural heritage and transnational crime as the impacts of it, please?
Yeah, thanks, Jade. I think underwater cultural heritage is a really interesting lens through which to look at transnational crime because of the, if you'll excuse the terrible pun, the murky waters that it's in. Taking a step back from the specifics of underwater cultural heritage, the trafficking of heritage objects in general is almost always transnational, right? So you've got objects that are moving across borders from source countries that are typically lower income countries, including countries in the global south or places that are going through economic or political instability. They're smuggled across borders and sold typically in higher income countries. So the existing measures to combat antiquities trafficking are kind of siloed in these three phases. We've got source countries that have cultural property laws, patrimony laws, protect the heritage within national borders. So it prohibits looting and export outside of the borders. And then some countries have customs regulations to kind of stop transit or to intercept objects as they're transiting across borders. And then we're seeing as well more and more attention at the destination part of the smuggling chain, where we're seeing some countries in Europe and North America that are starting to prosecute dealers and collectors for mostly possessing stolen property. But this kind of siloing makes it really difficult to address the issue as a whole, at the transnational criminal market as a whole, because this source transit destination, as helpful as it is not that clear cut. The interfaces are really blurred. And a lot of these frameworks are also based on the idea of returning objects to a country of origin, which can be really complicated and contentious when it comes to heritage. Like if we think, for example, of the Roman Empire, like how many nations does that cover today? Who would we return it to? And underwater cultural heritage, I think, really crystallizes those issues just by nature of being in maritime space. And when I talk about underwater cultural heritage in the context of transnational crimes, I'm talking about shipwrecks. Obviously, underwater cultural heritage is a lot more than just shipwrecks. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to focus on shipwrecks because that is what treasure hunters are targeting. And shipwrecks are also transnational by nature. Ships are, tools for us to go beyond our territories, beyond the land, into these kind of liminal spaces, seas, oceans, even rivers that are outside territory, outside the nation, outside the state. And when they wreck, they're usually not in the place that they came from, right? So a ship that was built in Italy, that it by Italians or Romans, what have you, on its way to Spain might wreck in Italian waters or Spanish waters or French waters, or maybe just in the middle of the Mediterranean. And when we're talking about shipwrecks that are being targeted by treasure hunters, they're carrying valuable cargo that might have come from a completely other place as well. The example that we used in our paper was the Geldermalsen, which is also known as the Nanking cargo. It was a Dutch ship, part of the Dutch East India Company. It was sailing back from China, where it had picked up a cargo of porcelain. It was going to Indonesia, to the port of Batavia, which is now Jakarta, for a refuel stop before going back to the Netherlands. It sank in 1752 on its way back to Indonesia. It was salvaged in 1985 by an Australian treasure hunter named Mike Hatcher, who claims that it was in international waters, and so he did not need a permit to salvage. The Indonesian government, on the other hand, says it was in Indonesian waters, and as he did not have a permit, the porcelain was stolen from the Indonesian state. And so if we think about the existing frameworks, the goal here would be to return objects to the country of origin. But who does this porcelain go back to? Does it go back to China? That's where it was made. It's Chinese porcelain. It's part of Chinese, the history and heritage of Chinese manufacturing. But it was bought by a private Dutch company that has since gone under. And when it went under, the Dutch government seized all of its assets. So is it Dutch property or is it Indonesian property? Because if it was within the Indonesian waters, according to cultural property laws, it is Indonesian property. But of course, if the treasure hunter is right and it's in international waters, that opens up a whole new set of issues. And if we shift the goal to trying to protect it before it's even looted, then whose responsibility is it? Same question here. It's a Dutch ship. Should it be the Dutch government's responsibility to protect it, or Indonesia's responsibility? Or if it's international waters, even more questions. And so I think thinking about underwater cultural heritage in the context of transnational crimes really forces us to rethink notions of sovereignty by taking a view from the sea, where borders are kind of fluid, and responsibility is either it's everyone's responsibility or no one's responsibility or some people's responsibility. And I think this is a key way of reframing the issue from something that has to do with ownership and property to something that is about responsibility, and particularly communal responsibility. And we have some guidance in existing international frameworks like the Law of the Sea and the 2001 UNESCO Convention, where cooperation for research is really important and emphasized. but there's very little guidance on policing. So it's helpful to turn to other tools like the Transnational Organized Crime Convention or the High Seas Treaty that help us contextualize, recontextualize this issue in new spaces. But I'm kind of outside of my area here, so I'm really excited to hear some of what you guys are bringing to the table with this issue.
Thank you, Charlotte. That's really interesting. Yes, so of course the extent of the High Seas Treaty or the BBNJ was really covered in Sarah's paper. So I'll turn to you now, Sarah. Your paper is called the Transnational Maritime Environmental Crime and the BBNJ Agreement. Can you please expand on the utility of the BBNJ in the TMEC context, please?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jade, and thank you for your kind introduction at the beginning. I actually have some slides as well, so I'll just pop those up. Bear with me while I do that. Okay, you should all be able to see that. Thank you for that question, because I think it really goes to the heart of my paper. So my paper very much focused on the dynamic relationship between the BBNJ agreement, which was recently adopted at the UN, and transnational maritime environmental crime. And what I wanted to do was examine ways that the new instrument could assist in efforts to combat such crime. So we know that areas beyond national jurisdiction are a prime target for transnational maritime environmental crime due to the fragmented international legal frameworks and institutions that govern law enforcement activities, alongside a general lack of coordination and cooperation. Now, because these maritime zones are located so far offshore, the myriad of criminal activities and their associated impacts on the marine environment, including its resources and ecosystems, are extremely challenging to monitor and control. So in the absence of effective oversight, marine areas beyond national jurisdiction are facing a growing list of threats from TMEC, and this will inevitably have an impact on the health and resilience of our marine biodiversity. And so what that got me thinking about was, of course, we've faced similar problems in efforts to protect biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, otherwise known as BBNJ. So to date, efforts to protect BBNJ have been really undertaken by a patchwork of global, regional, and sectorial organizations and bodies, each one having their own mandates and priorities, but none really having a core focus on the protection of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And this has inevitably led to coverage gaps, weak implementation of and compliance with existing arrangements, and again, a general lack of cooperation when it comes to the protection of our deep ocean environment. So when we look at the overriding or general objective of the new BBNJ agreement, the instrument seeks to secure the long-term protection and integrated management of BBNJ through the effective implementation of relevant provisions of the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, but also by furthering international cooperation and coordination. So my motivation was really to test that new framework of the BBNJ agreement and see what it could do in the space of transnational maritime environmental crime. And so what I found was that although the provisions of the new BBNJ agreement are not intended to directly address TMEC, the instrument does contain a number of cooperative mechanisms and tools that I think could provide inspiration and lessons for the development of a more harmonized, cooperative, and coordinated multilateral response to transnational organized crime at sea. So in addition to its cooperative mechanisms, the instrument contains a very sophisticated and elaborate institutional arrangement that I think could also provide a very important platform for the formation of key partnerships and alliances by means of regional and bilateral dialogues, outreach, and coalition building. And I think this could really assist in addressing transnational maritime environmental crime and mobilizing and sustaining momentum in tackling this global issue. So to provide you with an example, one of the overriding aims of the BBNJ agreement is to conserve and sustainably use priority protection areas through the establishment of a comprehensive system of area-based management tools with ecologically representative and well-connected networks of high seas marine protected areas, or MPAs. So the BBNJ agreement is really seen as a vital step towards achieving the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Pact to protect at least 30% of marine habitats by 2030. And so its area-based management tool process could also prove promising as a potential mechanism for progress in the battle against certain types of TMEC, such as illegal fishing and pollution. So, for instance, the consultation and cooperative mechanisms that have been incorporated into the BBNJ agreement's process for the designation of area-based management tools could present opportunities to further regional and bilateral dialogue on fisheries crimes, including IUU fishing, as well as the incidental catch of deep-sea vulnerable fish stocks. So while the BBNJ agreement cannot directly impose its procedures on existing fisheries management bodies, and it actually remains to be seen how those consultation and cooperative mechanisms will actually work in practice. Its elaborate institutional arrangements could provide a setting to promote and encourage efforts in crafting solutions to fisheries issues, including the adoption of spatial management measures that provide for lasting conservation benefit as well as sustainable use. So the BBNJ agreement really lays out a sophisticated process when it comes to establishing area-based management tools. So state parties will be able to submit proposals for the establishment of high seas MPAs. They can do so individually or collectively. And under the agreement, the proposals regarding the establishment of the MPA must be submitted either collectively or individually to the BBNJ Secretariat. And the Conference of the Parties will be the ultimate decision-making body when it comes to these spatial management tools. Now, in developing a proposal, state parties will be required to cooperate by way of collaboration and consultation with relevant stakeholders, including existing relevant instruments, frameworks, and bodies to achieve the objectives of the BBNJ agreement. So, for example, these stakeholders will naturally include the International Maritime Organization as the specialized agency of the UN responsible for the safety and security of international shipping, as well as RFMOs, Regional Fisheries Management Organizations, which form one of the building blocks of high seas fisheries management. So the BBNJ agreement really provides an important platform for all sectors and stakeholders to contribute effectively to the protection of BBNJ by fostering dialogue and bringing together the various existing organisations and bodies with competences in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So the cooperative mechanisms that have been incorporated into the agreement could hold the potential to strengthen coordination between the BBNJ agreement and existing relevant instruments, frameworks, and bodies, particularly when it comes to the designation and implementation of area-based management tools beyond national jurisdiction. So just quickly, the IMO, for example, is already experienced in adopting MARPOL special areas and particularly sensitive sea areas. So the IMO will be a relevant stakeholder in the consultation process for the establishment of area-based management tools under the BBNJ agreement, because these tools may have implications for vessel source pollution control on the high seas. So a main issue during the negotiations was finding ways to resolve potential overlaps and inconsistencies and conflicts between area-based management tools already established under existing instruments, as well as those that will be established under the BBNJ agreement. And so what delegations generally agreed upon was that cooperation and coordination would be indispensable to remedy that disordered and fragmented management that we currently have in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And so arguably the same reasoning applies in the context of transnational maritime environmental crime. So to overcome that lack of cooperation and coordination in the protection of marine biodiversity, the BBNJ agreement really incorporates some key cooperative mechanisms. So, for example, the Conference of the Parties, in taking a decision on the establishment of an area-based management tool, they will be required to respect the competences of existing governance institutions and to make arrangements for regular consultations with relevant entities, including the RFMOs and the International Maritime Organization. And so the BBNJ agreement is actually really unusual because its success will not only depend on implementation by state parties, but also global, regional, and sectorial bodies that already have sectorial area-based management tools at their disposal. And in concluding that thought, I think one of the most exciting prospects moving forward is that we potentially can see the co-development of area-based management tools beyond national jurisdiction, where we have a number of these bodies working together and trying to target particular conservation objectives, but also sustainable use. So thanks, Jade. I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. That's an amazing overview of the BBNJ and such an interesting collaboration of concepts. So thank you for that. Okay, so I'm just going to now redirect again in the same order to ask another question of each of our panelists. So Julie, I'll come back to you. Can you please unpack the need for understanding the harms of TMEC in the Global South, please?
Well, it's really just to reiterate what others have said and what I've said around kind of a broader conceptualization of what harms entail and how they're converging, and particularly how new harms are converging with old harms and how we engage with that, and the need for innovation to deal with these harms. And I'm just kind of thinking as well in terms of the harms, the profound harms of kind of global inequalities and kind of neo-colonial resource extraction. That is just something that we kind of engage with. It's not criminalized. It's how do you engage with that kind of inequality? And given the fact that the least powerful and the most vulnerable are usually the target of that, and this kind of criminal selectivity of who gets criminalized and who doesn't. And it's not to deny that the harms of kind of criminal networks, but it's also to try to understand the fact that very often these are not just environmental criminal issues, but they're deeply intertwined with social justice and equity issues in terms of people depending on oceans for a variety of things, in terms of their livelihoods, in terms of their food security, and also in terms of their own cultural identities. So it's again to kind of try to understand the nature of harms as assemblages involving humans as not just a criminal thing, but also deeply intertwined in people's sense of who they are. I mean, so we did some research in the Maldives, and the ocean is really kind of a part of the culture, part of the sensibility of communities. So you can't just extract that and think of the ocean as a human resources or something to extract resources from, but it's also kind of that a way of thinking of the ocean as a part of kind of human assemblages. And then what does that mean in terms of understanding the harms of the ocean or the harms to the ocean or the harms related to the ocean as a space of flow or the ocean as a conduit for harms being enacted? And trying to fit these harms in kind of jurisdictional understandings and spaces and legal and human mechanisms. Whereas again, these harms kind of transcend all of that in terms of the convergence increasingly of climate change related harms converging with conventional harms that we're talking about in terms of planetary harms and how we engage with that. So we're not just talking about jurisdictions or countries or local communities, we're talking about the planet and trying to think about harms in that way. So it's just to extend, that's me really just talking about this concept of harmscape, of which criminal activity is a part of that, and trying to understand the evolving nature of harmscapes related to human livability. But maybe I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. So Annette, I'll turn to you now. So the lack of harmonization in the approaches to blue crimes, particularly those in the Global South, may further exacerbate the issue. Are there any strategies to incentivize regulation that can be positively impactful for TMEC?
The mic again. Thanks for the question, Jade. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the paper that you and I co-wrote. So Jade and I did this paper on blue crimes and ocean harmscapes. And basically we made a big argument around using carrot stick methodologies to basically incentivize regulation, but then also deal with less desirable behavior differently, the stick method. But I just want to point out again, like the harmonization issue is a bit of a hot potato, as the paper by Julie and myself suggests. So we don't believe that there's a one fits all kind of approach. So yes, there needs to be some harmonization, but we need to be very careful that there are very specific contextual landscapes and context at play that we need to take cognizance of. So essentially, the carrot stick approaches incentivize compliance among stakeholders. So this can range from local communities to state actors, also to corporates. Then on the carrot side, we can create incentives for communities and local industry by promoting, for example, sustainable practices and offering economic alternatives to illegal activities. And there are many fantastic examples available from the wildlife trade, but from a range of illegal market and trades. And Jade and myself provide examples in our paper, and then by transference, we make an argument how to apply that to TMECs. So, for example, incentives could include training programs. It could be grants, or it could be sustainable fishing certification that align with international standards. So there are a whole bunch of carrots, and they're mostly driven towards livelihoods, alternative livelihoods, and encouraging sustainable practices. The stick aspect usually involves some form of enforcement or possible penalties, and that, strictly speaking, is again targeted at criminal activities. And again, I'd like to differentiate between crimes, harms, and risks. And it's again, just to point out, it's not as easy as to say, well, the one is illegal and the other activity is legal. So just to keep that in mind. But in essence, a stick would often involve strict penalties and some type of enforcement. So we show different instances where it works, but we also were at pains to point out that we are very keen on really sort of relying on this Southern Blue criminology framing. So it's essential to develop governance frameworks that are contextually adaptive to regional socioeconomic realities. And then again, the whole of society sort of framing. And what we also were quite concerned about is that a lot of interventions are often targeted, yes, at communities, but we are not gender sensitive. So we don't necessarily include women in our responses. We don't analyze how women are impacted by different harms and risks. And often the experiences are different, and the responses and the incentives also have to be different. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. That was such a great answer. Charlotte, now I'll redirect to you. So what are the key takeaways to how we can respond to TMEC locally, regionally, and internationally?
Yeah, I really resonated with some of the principles that Julie talked about with Southern Blue criminology, especially when it comes to defining victims and offenders and the criminalization of vulnerable population that rely on the ocean. Because when we think about antiquities trafficking, oftentimes we see that the source countries and the people who are in the source countries run the highest risk for the lowest reward. They are both victim and offender because it is their cultural heritage, it is their history. But we have found that a lot of research has shown that the looters in source countries tend to loot opportunistically just to kind of round out the month to feed their families and such. whereas as the object moves through the chain, the smuggling chain, and it gets to the destination, you know, these objects go for millions, and there's very little consequences for the people who are buying and dealing looted antiquities in destination countries. And so I think it's really interesting to take this view and kind of like look at the chain holistically and try to break one link in the chain, which I think is really important to look at the destination side, where so much of this is done in the open. It's a very public crime. It actually requires it needs to be public, because the goal is to put objects in auctions and museums to publish, to exhibit. And the more we do this, the more value the object gains, right? So increasing the risk at the destination, and again, going back to some of the principles that Julie talked about, bringing in the private sector, and even going to the quote unquote offenders at the destination, the art market, the dealers, the museums, and changing the way that they are thinking of these objects, that they are dealing with provenance, for example, really increasing the transparency on that end without necessarily criminalizing or prosecuting, which I know is ironic considering I work for the prosecutor's office. But yeah, I just think it's such a fascinating space to be in, and to think differently about these smuggling chains from these various perspectives. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you. That was really, you added so much value there. So thank you so much, Charlotte. That was great. Sarah, now can I turn to you? So resources and technology are limitations to responding effectively in such a vast ocean scape. Are there any tools or mechanisms that can assist?
Another great question, Jade. So yes, spot on. So a lack of resources and technology has really been a major impediment in tackling TMEC. And so similar issues when it comes to capacity have been encountered in the BBNJ context as well. And so what we found was, as greater scientific knowledge of areas beyond national jurisdiction will be critical in order to ensure the long-term protection of BBNJ, we had to come up with some innovative mechanisms and tools to incorporate into the BBNJ agreement in order to promote cooperation and coordination for marine scientific research, but for other activities as well. And that was not only to improve our understanding of the deep ocean environment, but so that we can make better decision-making going forward. And so these innovative mechanisms are underpinned, more importantly, by a renewed sense of and duty to cooperate. And so what we actually see now in the BBNJ agreement is an explicit duty for state parties to facilitate cooperation in capacity building, as well as the development and transfer of technology. And that's there to assist developing states in achieving the objectives of the instrument. And so in doing so, state parties are to cooperate at all levels and in all forms, including through collaborative partnerships with relevant stakeholders. So this was mainly done in order to create and enhance not only the human, but the financial, technological, institutional, and resource capabilities of state parties, and in particular, those in the Global South, developing states. So the capacity building initiatives of the BBNJ agreement include a number of activities, including the sharing and use of data, information, knowledge, and research results, as well as the development and strengthening of infrastructure, including equipment and capacity of personnel, as well as ways to support research and development capabilities, including data management. So as cooperation very much underpins the BBNJ agreement, its institutional arrangements can also provide an important fora when it comes to the formation of key collaborative partnerships and alliances. And I really think, going back to what I was talking about earlier, it could be a vital platform for encouraging dialogue on ways to overcome resource constraints, shortcomings in technology, and obstacles in coordination. So for example, at the moment, one of the main issues we face in combating TMEC is data, which is scattered across different global, regional, and national organizations and institutions. Oftentimes that data is also fragmented based on its thematic or geographical coverage. And so I think one of the really exciting things I personally like about the BBNJ agreement is that it's established a clearinghouse mechanism. And I think this could provide a really invaluable practical tool when it comes to enhancing data sharing and ensuring equitable access to data as well. And so what the clearinghouse mechanism is like under the BBNJ agreement, it's a hub and spoke network model. So it'll be a central hub, which will be overseen by the Secretariat. And then more importantly, it will provide links to other clearinghouse mechanisms, repositories, and databases. Now, the specific modalities for the operation of the clearinghouse will be decided a little bit down the track, but I do think that it's already been tasked with some very wide-ranging tasks and functions. So, for example, it will serve as a centralized platform to enable parties to access, provide, and disseminate information with respect to data, as well as technological knowledge and research relating to BBNJ. So that's just one of the tools that I think could be really beneficial moving forward. Thanks, Jade.
Wow, that sounds crucial to understanding the issues that we have in this space. So yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. I'm now going to open up to see if we have any questions from our audience. You can put something in the chat or raise a Q&A if you have any questions. In the meantime, do any of our panelists have any other questions for each other, or are we all fairly satisfied with our extensive answers that we've provided? Great. Well, look, it looks as though there's been no questions come through on the chat. So I guess we should just leave it there at this stage then. Is everybody okay with that in the panel? Yeah, everyone's fine with that. Fantastic. Well, thank you all for joining us and for our experts as well. What an amazing discussion, and I hope it's all been very interesting well, it's certainly been fascinating for me, and I'm sure all of us got something out of tonight or today, 24 hours. And so I appreciate you all coming in and joining us. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.